All right, everybody, thank you for tuning in. This is Learning 3. If you're following along, we first did a learning on tefillin and mezuzot and why Karaites don't wear tefillin and mezuzot. In Learning 2, we talked about how blue fringes lead to a sanctified life. Yaakov Walker helped us with that. And this learning is a Karaite perspective on the high holidays. I want you to notice that I called this a Karaite perspective, not the Karaite perspective. The reason for that is because, as we'll see, there's no one unanimous Karaite opinion here. There are some overwhelming majority opinions, absolutely, and some minority opinions. We'll look at both of those. So maybe I should call it Karaite perspectives, but the point is it's not the Karaite perspective. And I talk about this on the high holidays. I just want to make sure you know high holidays is not a term from the Torah. It's not a translation of a term from the Torah or the Tanakh. The high holidays, for those of you who are new to this, refer to what most people call Rosh Hashanah, what the Torah calls Yom Teruah or Zichron Teruah, which we'll look at, and Yom Kippur. So Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, those two holidays are called the high holidays. This is the famous twice-a-year Jew, the Jew who goes to synagogue twice a year. They're going on the high holidays, on what is referred to as Rosh Hashanah and what is Yom Kippur. As I say here in the cover and the promotional slide here, there are a lot of beautiful traditions for the holidays of the seventh month. Now, I want you to point out that I've moved from high holidays, which is a non-biblical term, to the holidays of the seventh month, which is this is the Hebrew seventh month. These holidays all occur in the seventh month. So I'm trying to be a little bit more biblical in how I'm referring to this. And the question is, what does the Torah say about these holidays? And of course, since this is a Karaite learning, what is the Karaite take? The term take here is a play on words. You'll see when we get to the verses regarding Sukkot, what it means to take. And the Karaites and the Rabbinites have different perspectives on taking in that regard. Before we go on, I just want to look back at this thing. I said the seventh month. That might be a surprise for many people because most people think that we call this holiday Rosh Hashanah because it's the first day of the first month. Rosh Hashanah means New Year's, head of the year. But I want to point out that in the Torah, this is actually the first day of the seventh month. And if you ask the rabbis, you ask the rabbinic Jews, why is this called Rosh Hashanah? They're not going to tell you it's because it's the first day of the year. They're going to tell you it's because there are 4 New Years throughout the year. And this New Year, the one that starts on the seventh month, is a new year for the world. It was, in their tradition, a reflection of the creation of the world, and the world was created at this time or on this day. And so they are saying that this is a new year for the world. So if you're a little bit confused why Rosh Hashanah is in the seventh month, we'll talk about that. Okay, so bear with me for a bit. We'll get to that. So as we go through this talk, I want you to think to yourself how ritual relates to the holidays of the seventh month. There are lots of beautiful traditions here. And the question is how many of them are directly commanded and how many of them are reasonable interpretations of the text and how many of them are later customs. Customs could be great, customs could be not so great. But always ask yourself that question with respect to your Jewish studies. So I've actually provided you 5 images that are a series of pictures that sum up what most people think of when they talk about the seventh month. On the far left here, you have a Jewish man, a Yemenite Jew, blowing the shofar. If you ask Rabbinites, or ask Jews, I should just say, what do they associate with Rosh Hashanah? They will say apples and honey maybe, but most of them will tell you the blowing of the shofar. Moving one image to the right, you'll see the inside picture, the title page of a Karaite prayer book. And this prayer book is a special prayer book that is designed for the 10 days of mercy or rachamim between Yom Teruah, which is the biblical name for what people call Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur. And we'll talk about what this prayer book is for. The Torah actually doesn't tell us what to do in the 10 days between these holidays. So here is a Karaite custom, and Rabbinite Jews do something very similar as well. Here's a Karaite custom that is not explicit in the Torah, yet, as far as I could tell, it's a universal Karaite, and as far as I know, a universal Rabbinite custom to do something between these 10 days as well. The question is, why? And then there's a picture of no eating, right? So that's because of Yom Kippur, you fast on Yom Kippur, and the question is fasting directly commanded, or is it a reasonable interpretation of what's commanded, or is it implicitly commanded? Or is it a later custom? Then to the right of that, you have pictures of Orthodox Rabbinite Jews, in this case, Rabbinite Jewish men, shaking the lulav for the holiday of Sukkot. Again, if you ask most Jews what they associate with Sukkot, they'll tell you the lulav and etrog. And this is a rabbinic custom of shaking the lulav. This is not a Karaite custom. We'll talk about that in a second. And in the far right, you have people dancing with the Torah for Simchat Torah. And the question is, what is Simchat Torah? Simchat Torah is the joy of the Torah. This is a holiday that is observed by almost all Jews everywhere, as far as I know, but the holiday is not mentioned anywhere in the Torah. Although it's called the joy of the Torah, it's a little bit of a bittersweet holiday for me because it actually has suppressed a true biblical holiday in many communities, and we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, before we go on, I just want to make sure that you know that you can always support Karaite Jewish research. You can donate to bluethread.com, you can donate to thekaritepress.com, you can buy a book from thekaritepress.com. All of our paperbacks are, I think, $25 or under. This is our newest release, The Palanquin. We'll talk about this book today. The Palanquin is very interesting, especially if you are familiar with the traditional Karaite halacha. This book was written by a Polish-Lithuanian Karaite, so he was from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And he is summarizing the customs and halachic views of his place and time. And it's a really wonderful book, but some of the views differ from what I would say is the Egyptian Karaite community. And we'll talk maybe about one or two of those today. Okay, so the Moadim of the seventh month. I mentioned earlier that this is the seventh month. We'll explain that right now. Moadim are festivals or appointed times. And Moed is a singular term of festival or appointed time. So let's talk about what the basics of these are. Leviticus 23 talks about all of our yearly holidays. Well, I guess 23 talks about Shabbat, and that's a weekly appointed time. And then you're going to see a bunch of texts in black there, the Passover sacrifice, Hag HaMatzot, Feast of the Seventh Day, or the gathering of the seventh day of Passover, then the counting of the Omer all the way up to Shavuot. But we're going to focus on the part at the bottom. Okay, the part on the bottom that's in red, it says that in the seventh month, on the first day, there should be a Zichron Teruah. And Numbers 29:1 calls it Yom Teruah, but there'll be a Zichron Teruah. Then on the ninth day at even, to the 10th day at even, is Yom HaKippurim or Yom Kippur. When you see even, that means evening. After that is Hag HaSukkot. On the 15th day and on the 22nd day, there's this holiday Shemini Atzeret. Remember a few moments ago I told you that most Jewish communities today are celebrating Simchat Torah? Well, Simchat Torah, in my opinion, is a beautiful concept, like the rejoice of the Torah, but it has overshadowed this biblical holiday of Shemini Atzeret, and we'll talk about that. We're going to talk today about the shofar, which, as I mentioned to you, is what most people associate with the holiday of, quote, Rosh Hashanah. We're going to talk about Rosh Hashanah and whether or not the seventh month or Yom Teruah itself can be deemed as a new year. And we're going to talk about the Akedah. The Akedah is the binding of Isaac. And I want to relate a personal story right now. It was 1999 or so, and I was just coming into my own Karaite viewpoints. And I was on this forum for Karaite Jewish learning. It was actually Yahoo groups. I don't know if Yahoo still exists today. I know everyone uses Facebook groups. It shows you how long ago I went to college. And I was studying in this Yahoo Groups forum for Karaites, and it was discussed that the holiday that we're calling Rosh Hashanah is actually the first day of the seventh month. And I was shocked. I'm like, how is this even possible? How is it that I, as a Karaite, never knew this? So one year for Erev Rosh Hashanah, or Erev Yom Teruah, as we'll talk about in a second, I went to my uncle's house, and I actually spoke to a different uncle who was the leader of the Karaite Jewish community at the time, the spiritual leader. And I told him how frustrated I was that this was not the new year, that this was the first day of the seventh month. And he looked at me and kind of smiled. And he said, Sean, the Torah doesn't call this Rosh Hashanah. It gives it a different name, Yom Teruah. And I had never heard of Yom Teruah. Didn't make any sense to me. What is this Yom Teruah thing? And the reason why it didn't make any sense to me is because I went through Jewish education at a rabbinic school, and not an Orthodox school, but a conservative one for my Jewish education, my Jewish learning. And it was a wonderful school. I learned a tremendous there, but they focused on what everyone calls the holiday, Rosh Hashanah. Why do you go any deeper than that? No point. And then I would go to the Karaite services, and I wasn't paying attention. Maybe my Hebrew wasn't strong enough. I just kind of went through the motions, and I didn't even notice that the texts we were reading talked about Teruah, Yom Teruah, Zichron Teruah, and they did not talk about Rosh Hashanah, right? So I wasn't paying attention. The combination of me not paying attention and maybe not knowing enough Hebrew at the time, I still don't know enough Hebrew. You can never know enough Hebrew. And never have been told what the holiday was an eye-opening experience for me. It was eye-opening because I felt a little bit empty inside. And it wasn't until a year or two later when I realized why I was so frustrated. I was frustrated because I actually had all the tools I needed to learn, yet I didn't take advantage of them. I had a prayer book. I could have opened up the prayer book and read. I have a Tanakh. I have an online concordance. I could have looked at everything and learned for myself. I could have paid attention when I went to synagogue and they did the Torah readings about Yom Teruah, but I didn't do any of that stuff. So I was frustrated with myself. And at that point, I promised to turn that frustration into a lifetime of learning. And here I am some 17, 18 years later, continuing to learn. So thank you for learning with me. Let's talk now about the shofar. Okay, so this is one of the first images I showed you, a Yemenite Jew blowing the shofar. In the rabbinic tradition, there's a very prescribed way of how you blow the shofar. And the reason they blow this in this prescribed way is because this holiday is called the Yom Teruah. And there's a debate in the rabbinic tradition as to what sound is teruah. Is it an alarm sound? Is it a sound of an alarm? Is it a joyous sound? So they have a prescribed way of blowing the shofar. You could look that up in the Talmud if you want, or in most online sources, and you can figure out it exactly and the reason for that. We're not going to get into that today, but I just want to show you that this is a rabbinic interpretation of blowing the shofar. And the question is this, quote, the correct interpretation? Is it, quote, the wrong interpretation? And is it the most logical interpretation? So let's look at that. Okay, what does the Torah say? So remember, this holiday in the Torah is called Yom Teruah, or Zichron Teruah here in Leviticus. So here we are, Leviticus in the Hebrew. Daber al bnei Yisrael lemor, b'chodesh hashavi'i be'echad l'chodesh, yeh lachem Shabbaton, Zichron Teruah, that's the part that matters. Zichron Teruah mikra kodesh. Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, in the 7th month, in the 1st day of the month, shall be a solemn rest unto you, a memorial proclaimed with the blast of horns, a holy convocation. So those words zichron is being translated as memorial, and the word teruah is being translated as proclaimed with the blast of horns. But what I actually want to show you here is that in Hebrew, the word horns is not there. Hebrew, the word horns is not there. This translation is done by JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, which is a rabbinic organization, institution, and they are translating this Torah that fits the rabbinic halacha, that fits the rabbinic framework. In the rabbinic tradition, when you see teruah in Zichron Teruah and Yom Teruah, you must understand that it means a blast of horns, shofar in particular. That's what the rabbinic view is. But the text doesn't say horns. They've added this word to the translation to make it easier for you as an English reader. And there's nothing wrong with that. Okay? I'm here as a Karaite telling you I don't agree with this interpretation in this translation, but there's nothing wrong with what JPS did. Why? Because every translation is an interpretation. Every translation is an interpretation, and if you are a rabbinic Jew translating something for somebody, of course you should choose a rabbinic interpretation in your translation. Let's think back to lesson 1, and we talked about the saying, she hit the nail on the head. She hit the nail on the head. What does that mean? Does it mean she got it exactly right? Does it mean that she hit the nail on the nail's head? Or does it mean that there was a nail on my head and she hit that nail? Or there's a nail on somebody's head and she hit that nail? Each one of those interpretations needs to be translated. But unless you're going to translate something very mechanically in a way that may not make any sense, you would translate that 3 different ways into a foreign language. She hit the nail on the head. She got it exactly right. You would translate that differently from she hit the nail on the nail's head. Or she hit the nail that was on my head. And there's nothing wrong with translating it according to that rabbinic interpretation. That makes sense. They're trying to be a resource for people who follow the rabbinic tradition. Therefore, they've translated it this way. But I want to point out the text does not say horns. This is the interpretation. So the question becomes, well, what is teruah? Sean, you're saying the text doesn't say horns, but could it be horns? And the answer is yes. Right? So let's look at what teruah means. I put together this chart several years ago, and I went through all the instances in the Tanakh of how teruah is used, and I classified them. Now, I'm a Karaite, and I believe it's imperative that you show your work. Right? I want you to be able to check my work and tell me whether you agree with me or disagree with me. So I have published it for you. I've also published it on my blog previously. But I went through all of the interpretations. I went through all of the verses where teruah is mentioned, and I categorized them. All the way in the far left, we have shouting, literally or figuratively. And there's 16 of those there. Then one to the right of that is verse that I think is likely shouting. So, you 16 plus that one is 17. Then you have silver trumpets. Teruah is mentioned in conjunction with silver trumpets 5 times, as far as my interpretation. The one to the right of that is a bunch of miscellaneous categories. That things like joy, rejoicing, sacrificing, teshuvah. Teshuvah means repentance or returning to the way, and the sounds of instruments. Then there's exactly one, in my opinion, very clear, explicit use of the shofar and teruah together. It says on Yom Kippur, not in Yom Teruah, on Yom Kippur in the Jubilee year. So not every year. It says that there should be a shofar teruah. So it's very clear that in one case, the Torah commands a shofar teruah. And then on the far right here, I have things that are likely shofar. There's about 5 of them there. So if you were just looking at the number of occurrences, right, you were just counting these things up, you'd say, well, there's about 34 of these. Well, of the ones that are clearly shouting versus one that's clearly shofar, it's 16 to 1. 16 to 1, clearly shouting versus clearly shofar. You would think to yourself, wait a minute, why would anybody interpret teruah to mean shofar? Right? And if you add up all of the ones that are shouting, likely shouting, miscellaneous non-shofar, silver trumpets, and compared it to the ones that are shofar or likely shofar, it's like 28 to 6. Okay, somebody can do the math at home. 28 to 6 of something other than shofar. Again, so why would somebody think that this has to mean a shofar? In the rabbinic tradition, they have an oral law that tells them this. Okay, but I don't come from the rabbinic tradition, so I'm looking at the text, and I don't think it's the most natural interpretation. Now, when I was in law school, we had a professor in my contracts class. Let's call him Bob, Professor Bob. Professor Bob was a master at working with the facts. Right? His viewpoint was generally that if you can control the factual narrative, you can win your case. Right? So whoever controls the factual narrative has the best chance of winning your case. That's his general view, especially when you get to trial and disputes like that. Well, he also mentioned something to us, this concept of a jujitsu move. A jujitsu move is where you take the facts as your opponent says them, and you turn them on their head. Say, look, you're right, but they don't mean what you think they mean. We're doing Jewish learning here or Hebrew learning here. Maybe we'll call it a Krav Maga move. Anyway, Professor Bob was passionate about us using facts in the way that they're the most advantageous to us. So if I were a Rabbinite Jew, if I wanted to say, Sean, you're wrong, or you Karaites are wrong here, a teruah must be from a shofar, what argument would I make? Well, I would say that Leviticus 25:9, which is 2 chapters after Leviticus 23, where we talk about Zichron Teruah, it mentions a shofar teruah. So when you see Leviticus 23, you must think of it in light of Leviticus 25, where it's very clear that we're talking about a shofar. Okay, that's an interesting argument. I would, of course, turn that on its head and say, but in Leviticus 25, it specifically says shofar. In Leviticus 23, it doesn't. Right? So those things must be different. That's what I would say. Or a rabbinite says, look, Sean, all of the examples you gave about shouting literally or figuratively on the far left and even the second one from the left, those are not from the Torah. Those are from later sources. Maybe the language changed. Right? That's an argument they can make. And I would say, okay, well, look, Joshua lived at the time of Moses. Language couldn't have changed that much between Moses and Joshua. That would be my response. And then they can maybe say, well, Sean, okay, you've got this also wrong in another way. You have to look at silver trumpets, and then you have to go to your miscellaneous non-shofar category and take all the ones that are instruments. Then you take the shofar, clear shofar one, and then you take the likely shofar one, and you realize that shofar, that teruah, is something that is likely formed by an instrument. Okay, that would maybe be a way to look at it. I still think it's overwhelmed by the other non-instrument references, but these are how you construct an argument. Okay, and so I produced my work for you so you can go through and see for yourself what does it mean. To be clear, the traditional Karaite view is that the shofar is not commanded. One thing I actually want to point out to you is that there is some subjectivity in how you categorize this, right? This is still a matter of interpretation. Psalms 89:16, I classified as miscellaneous non-shofar because I read the Psalms and I'm looking at this and thinking, this is about joy and rejoicing generally. It might be a shout, it might not be a shout, but it's generally about joy and rejoicing. So there is some subjectivity here, but please look at it yourselves. Now, on this specific verse, Psalms 89:16, JPS, a Jewish Publication Society, translates it as joyful shout, right? They say, happy is the people that know the joyful shout. And the joyful shout, there's Teruah, right? They looked at the context and they said, this means joyful shout. What's interesting is, right, we saw earlier that in the verse in Leviticus, they translated it as a memorial proclaimed with a blast of horns. Why are they coming up with a different translation? One, context matters. Two, there's actually no halachic implication for them by translating this as joyful shout. Right? So it is entirely possible that the same word could have a different meaning in different contexts. Even in my chart, I showed you the same word had a different meaning in different contexts. Okay, we're going to return to 89:16 in a bit when we look at the Karaite sage Daniel al-Kumisi. Okay, so what do the Karaite sages say? Well, we have this Hacham Jacob ben Reuven or Yaakov ben Reuven. By now, he should sound familiar to you, right? So we looked at him in the first learning. We discussed views of the difference between Sisiot and Tefillin. And James Walker, who did our second learning, he translated the commentary on the Book of Esther by Jacob ben Reuven. So this guy, I hope, is familiar to you by now. Well, James Walker, again, went to the manuscript. This has never been published as far as I know. And he went to the manuscript and he said, well, what is the commentary on Leviticus 23:24? And it says, besides the tekiah for the offering. So what you have to know here is that there's another sound, tekiah, that is made over the offerings, and it's done with a silver trumpet, not done with a shofar. Okay, so it says, besides the tekiah for offering, they should shout Yariu in every city, so as to make a proclamation to them to repent and purify their ways. So according to Jacob ben Reuven, Teruah means you should shout in every city to encourage repentance and to purify your ways. And the idea here is before Yom Kippur. That's what's not being said expressly here, but that's what's going on. And then he's got this other comment for Numbers 29. Remember I told you that, or I think I told you that, there's two verses, Zichron Teruah in Leviticus, and Numbers 29 says Yom Teruah. So he's saying, okay, what is Yom Teruah? He's saying it means by praise and by thanks. So you should do a Teruah of praise and thanks. Hallel ve'odot. Hallel is praise. Hodot are thanks. It could also mean acknowledgement. So it could be praise and acknowledgement. That's what Hodot could also mean. So you're acknowledging God's greatness. Thanks and acknowledgements are really the same thing. When you thank somebody, you are acknowledging something they did for you. Or, he says, it's by the sounds, Teruah, of the silver trumpets in the temple. Or by shouting, Teruah, with the voice. So Teruah of the kol, with the voice. Since he, that is God, did not mention sounding either trumpets or the shofar. And that's the argument I said earlier. Since here it does not mention anything about a horn or a trumpet, Karaite views that this is done by the voice, or the majority Karaite voice. Therefore, the Karaites, most of them, make do without blasting the shofar on this day, so that they would not profane the appointed time. Okay, so this is the 11th century, 1,000 years ago, and he's saying that most of the Karaites do a teruah of the voice, so that they do not profane the day. And this concept of profaning the day is a very nuanced one. And I want to explain it to you so you understand. His view, and I think the majority Karaite view, would be that if you are playing an instrument on a holy day, and God did not command you to play the instrument, you are profaning the day by playing the instrument. That's his view. And again, I think it's the majority view. And I actually spoke to a Chabad rabbi about this, and he said, well, isn't it okay to blow the shofar? And I said, no, because the majority Karaite view would be that you are profaning the day. You're doing an act of melacha, so an act of work that is not commanded. And he smiled and said, we have the same opinion too. And he said, we, the Chabad tradition, or Orthodox Jews, we can blow the shofar on the holy day, only in the matter that is according to our halacha, only in the matter that is according to the ways we were supposed to do it. But we can't blow the shofar just to make music. Okay, so that's what he's saying. Remember this verse, Psalms 89, we talked about it. JPS translated it as a joyful shout. One Karaite, Hacham Daniel al-Kumisi, cites this verse to support sounding of the shofar in Yom Teruah. Jacob ben Reuven, who we just looked at, said the majority of Karaites did not blow the shofar. Well, prior to him, there was at least one prominent Karaite, Daniel al-Kumisi, who advocated blowing the shofar. And he used Psalms 89:16 to support his view. But remember, it doesn't mention shofar. It only mentions Teruah. We looked at this. Okay. Well, let's look at what Hacham Daniel al-Kumisi says. So this is from the book Royal Attire, This book talks about Karaite and Rabbinite beliefs, and we added some Karaite and Rabbinite views in the appendix of the book. And at the appendix of the book, we wanted to make sure people knew that there was at least one very prominent Karaite who advocated blowing the shofar. And he says, and it is my opinion on Yom Teruah. So again, the day is called Yom Teruah. On Yom Teruah, aside from the sounding of trumpets that accompanied the temple sacrifices, they would sound in every city in order to proclaim to them, to remind them, return from your ways and purify your deeds because Yom HaKippurim is coming. That's very similar to what we just saw Jacob ben Reuven say, right? For every fast without repentance has no benefit. Therefore, happy is the man who, when he hears the voice of the sounding of the shofar, knows that it is upon him to prepare his deeds as it is written. Happy is the nation who knows the sounding. Right, so he says that this verse, Psalms 89:16, is actually proof that the shofar is either strongly advocated or commanded, depends how you read what he says, for the holiday of Yom Teruah. This is absolutely the minority Karaite opinion. Today, in our Karaite synagogues, we do not blow the shofar on Yom Teruah. Okay, Chacham Yefet ben Eli, who lived in Jerusalem, or he moved to Jerusalem shortly after Daniel Kumisi passed away, he says this. By the way, I should point out before we go on that James Walker, he went to the manuscript of Yefet ben Eli. Now, the manuscript for Yefet ben Eli is not in Hebrew, and it's not an Arabic script. It's in Judeo-Arabic. It's Arabic words with Hebrew letters. Okay, so he went and read Arabic words in Hebrew letters, and he transcribed it for me, and he translated it for me, and he did this all so that we can share it here today. And as far as I know, again, this has never been published. It might be buried in some article somewhere, but as far as I know, it's never been published. So what does Chacham Yefet ben Eli say? He says this is for his comments for for Numbers 29. Yet, since he, God, said Yom Teruah, but did not connect it to a shofar or anything else, it must be that this Teruah is without an instrument. We saw something very similar from Jacob ben Reuven. Now, why is it that Jacob ben Reuven is saying something very similar to the people before him? Well, for those of you who study a lot of commentaries, you know that oftentimes people are summarizing the views of the people before them, and they're borrowing views from people before them, and that's what's going on here. Okay, so Chacham Yefet ben Eli says Yom Teruah does not connect any type of instrument or a shofar, so it must be that a teruah is something else. It cannot be from an instrument. Thus, now here's him being a professor, right? Here's my view. It doesn't connect teruah with an instrument, and it should be without a voice. Now he's going to say, well, think about like somebody in the back of the classroom raising their hand. What if somebody said, right? So thus, if somebody were to say, isn't a teruah talel, a shout of praise, required not just during every festival, but even every day? So then what is the point of naming this day Yom Teruah, a day of Teruah? Right, so that's the objection. Okay, you tell me that this means a Teruah with a voice. That makes no sense. We should do that every day. That's the objection, right? And he wants to overcome this objection. So he says, we would say that there are two answers to this. First is that this Teruah on this day is required for the majority of the day. On other days, you might praise God here and there. But this is a day of Teruah, and you should do it the majority of the day. Second, since this Teruah is performed in all the cities of Israel, those who are clean and unclean alike can both participate in this meaningful act at the onset of the day, unlike the rest of the days of the year. Therefore, it is called the day of Teruah, because everybody is doing this. This is in every city, every person. I should say I have theories as to what he means by clean and unclean. And both can participate. We're not going to get into that right now because they're just theories, but we could talk about that offline if anybody has any questions. So Yom Teruah in the new year. So I've made this big point at the onset of this that Yom Teruah, which most people call Rosh Hashanah, is the first day of the 7th month of the calendar. It's not the first day of the first month. And so the question is, can Yom Teruah be a new year of sorts? Or can the 7th month in general be a new year of sorts? Well, let's see what the practice was of the Karaite community in Egypt. I looked at about 8 or so calendars from the Karaite community of Egypt, and you can see on the far right there's the front and back of them. Let's see what they say in the text of the calendar. They identify Yom Teruah, and it says Yom Teruah. Next to it says Rosh Hashanah. So they're giving both names. The biblical name that the Karaites know this to be Yom Teruah, And then they put Rosh Hashanah because, truth be told, that's how everybody associated the holiday. And under it, you can actually see in French, it's transliterated Rosh Hashanah. So there's no doubt that in Egypt, the Karaite community was calling this holiday Rosh Hashanah. And well, fast forward now, look at the Karaite calendar from the community in Israel today, this year, 2017, 2018. It only calls it Yom Teruah. It does not call it Rosh Hashanah. Why? Because there's been a noticeable move by the Karaite community of Israel to go back to the biblical foundations. It's called Yom Teruah in the Torah. They're going to call it Yom Teruah on their calendar. This is beautiful, and they should be commended for it. Anyway, so back to the question of, can the seventh month be a new year? Many Karaite sages held that the seventh month marked the beginning of the business year. The business year, not the creation of the world, marked the beginning of the business year. And why did they say that? You have to remember that ancient Israel, like actually much of Israel today, was an agricultural society. And agriculture was the most important business. Well, Sukkot, which is an agricultural holiday, is called the Feast of Gathering at the leaving of the year. And it was the turning of the year, called that in two separate places, the Feast of Gathering at the leaving of the year, and separately it's called the turning of the year. So if something is leaving and something is turning, the idea is that the year is renewed. It's going to be the new year. So the Karaites, going back 500 years, this is not something modern, probably even before 500 years, said that this is the beginning of the business year. There's one Karaite, Daniel al-Kumisi, who we looked at earlier. He believed that Yom Kippur was the start of the year, and that's based on his reading of Ezekiel. We're not going to get into it, but I do want to be honest and show you that there are some Karaites who viewed the seventh month as either the absolute new year or the new year of sorts with respect to the business calendar. Yom Teruah, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. Now, remember earlier I talked about, if you ask most Jews when they think of Rosh Hashanah, what do they think of? They think of the shofar, right? There's a famous rabbinite sage named Saadia Gaon, and he gave 10 reasons why rabbinites blow the shofar on Yom Teruah, on Rosh Hashanah. And one of the reasons he gave is because of the binding of Isaac. It's very well understood that in the rabbinic tradition, the shofar helps remember the binding of Isaac. So let's look at that verse. So the context here is that Abraham was about to sacrifice his son. And then it says that Abraham lifted up his eyes and he looked, or he saw, and behold, behind him a ram was caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering instead of his son. Now, what I want to point out to you is that the Hebrew there for horns is not shofar. It's bekarnav, by his horns, with his horns. A keren is usually the term for a horn when it is on an animal. Okay, shofar is after it's been turned into an instrument. So just understand that the Hebrew text here does not say shofar. So even though in the rabbinic tradition they say that the reason you blow the shofar is to remember the binding of Isaac, because this ram got caught with his horns, the text doesn't say shofar. And actually the text itself does not make any connection between Yom Teruah and the binding of Isaac. These are different books of the Torah completely. There's no express connection at all. I'm not saying it's the wrong interpretation. I'm just saying it's not a connection that is made by the Torah. Okay, well, I know I just told you I'm not saying it's the wrong interpretation. I don't think it's the right interpretation, but I mean, everyone's free to their own interpretation. Here's this book, The Palanquin. We talked about this at the beginning. It's a newest publication by the Karaite Press. And the person who wrote this, Aham Solomon ben Aaron, he says that the foundation of Yom Teruah is based in the binding of Isaac. And then he says, therefore, the custom preserved since early days is that on the 10 days between Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur, we get up at midnight for supplications, tahanunim, confessions, viduyim, penitential prayers, selichot, petitions, bakashot, and the reading of the passage, and Moses besought, which is Vaychal Moshe. Okay, so he says that this is based on the binding of Isaac. So obviously you could tell from what I said previously that I don't think this is, quote, the right interpretation, right? The text doesn't make this connection. Someone recently took a peek at this book, I asked him what he thought, and he said to me, Sean, why in the world would you as a Karaite publish a book about Karaite halacha or Karaite philosophy and spend all this time and resources, even though you don't believe in what this guy says? And I told him, it's exactly because I'm a Karaite. Exactly because I'm a Karaite that I'm publishing this book. It's so important that every Karaite opinion be studied so they can be accepted or rejected for their own true merits. This is a fascinating book with a lot of information and unique perspectives, different from my Egyptian Karaite community, and they must be studied so I can figure out Is my initial perspective correct, or is the perspective of somebody else correct? Okay. Remember I asked you at the beginning how many of the rituals and customs and observances and halachot, meaning laws of doing things, that we have for the 7th month are directly rooted in the scripture, and how many of them are interpretation of the scripture, and how many of them are later customs and additions, right? I think I showed you that Yom Teruah, the scripture does not say shofar. In the rabbinic tradition, they clearly think that this means shofar. I think I've shown you why I don't, or why the majority of Karaites do not agree with that. Then we talked about these 10 days between Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur, right? We discussed that, even going back 1,000 years, the Karaites were saying, and Rabbinites as well, are saying Yom Teruah, that we can prepare ourselves for the upcoming holiday of Yom Kippur, so we can have a meaningful fast, right? And then you get to Yom Kippur, and the question is, what does it mean when the Torah tells us to afflict the soul, right? The Torah doesn't say fast. It says, ye shall afflict your soul. It shall be unto you a Sabbath of solemn rest, and ye shall afflict your souls in the 9th day of the month at even. From even to even shall ye keep your Sabbath. Afflicting the soul generally means fasting. Okay, so there's a lot of biblical verses here that proves this. I use that term proves loosely. Afflicting the soul generally means fasting. If you look at Psalms 35:13, this is one that I've given for you, is that I afflicted my soul with fasting. So that is what we, Karaites and Rabbinites, think is the actual interpretation of these verses. When you see afflict your soul, unless it's qualified by something else, you should think fasting. There's actually a case I should tell you in Numbers 30, verse 14, where affliction of the soul is made in reference to taking on an oath. And this oath involves restricting yourself in some way. But the general view is that if it says afflict the soul and doesn't explain anything more, it means to fast. And again, the question is this the only interpretation of this verse? As far as I know, every Jewish community historically understood afflict your soul to mean fasting. And here's biblical proof as to why. Okay, Chag HaSukkot. We're going to talk about taking, shaking, building, and trail mix. Okay. Now, I should tell you that my favorite opinion of every Karaite opinion I've ever heard involves trail mix. We're going to talk about this because I'm excited about it. So Leviticus 23:40. This is the part of the Torah that talks about the commandments of Sukkot. And it says, and ye shall take. Remember I told you at the beginning that what's the Karaite take? Right, so there was a play on words for Sukkot. Well, here's the play on the words. It says, and ye shall take on the first day the fruit of the goodly trees, the branches of the palm trees, boughs of thick trees, and willows of the brook. And ye shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. First thing I want to point out to you is the rabbinic opinion here. The rabbinite view is that these 4 things you take, called the 4th species, are the etrog, the lulav, hadas, and arava. That's fine for their interpretation, but it's related to taking. And what do you do with it? In the rabbinic tradition, the minimal act you have to do, the very minimum act you have to do, is you have to lift these 4 items. And you say the blessing as you lift these 4 items. There is a rabbinic practice. I'll leave for the rabbinites to discuss whether or not this is a law or a strong custom or a strong practice, but there's a rabbinic practice of shaking the 4 species in 6 directions. They shake them north, south, east, west, up and down. So they're shaking the 4 species in the 6 cardinal directions. That's the general practice. And you could see here observant Rabbinite Jews shaking the lulav and etrog and 4 species. I actually don't think this is the right interpretation. Quotes from the Karaite perspective, who am I to say? As a Karaite, I have a different interpretation of these verses. We'll talk about that in a second. But I want to let you know that these men, and they're only men in this picture, are doing their best to honor their creator, honor our creator. I just come from a different perspective from what these verses mean. So before we get onto the majority view, I actually want to talk to you about the minority Karaite opinion. The minority Karaite opinion says you're supposed to take these shrubberies and greens and you're supposed to eat them during the holiday. You're supposed to eat them during the Hag. It's related to rejoicing before God. And the fact of eating these greens and shrubberies in and of itself makes you happy and helps you rejoice before God. That's the general view, and that's the minority view, and that is the trail mix opinion. I love that opinion because I'd never heard it until about 1.5 years ago. I call it the trail mix opinion. It's not exactly trail mix, but the truth is, my view is that I would love if Karaites everywhere this year for Sukkot ate something like trail mix. Take some walnuts, take some olives, take some other greens and shrubberies, some dates, right? And have them during Sukkot in honor of this minority Karaite view. I actually don't think it's the right view, and I use that term loosely. Again, who am I to say? Okay, let's now switch to the majority Karaite view. Leviticus 23:40, remember it says, you shall take. It doesn't say what to do with it, right? That's the issue here, is it doesn't say what to do with it. Right? The Rabbinites say you're supposed to lift these items. The minority Karaite is supposed to eat them. To Leviticus 42, though, it says, and you shall dwell in booths, and all that are homeborn in Israel shall dwell in booths. Now you go to Nehemiah 8:15, and it talks about the group of exiles that returned to the land of Israel. They did a public reading from the Torah, and they proclaimed that they should go out to the mountain and bring in the olive branches, and the oil tree branches, and myrtle branches, and date branches, and branches of the thick trees, to make booths as it is written. So according to the book of Nehemiah, the community of Jews who lived at that time, returning from exile, after a public reading of the Torah, they understood that you're supposed to take these items in order to build the Sukkot that we are dwelling in. So that's absolutely the majority view today. In fact, we talked about Hacham Yefet Ben Eli. He has a view based on Nehemiah 8:15 that Leviticus 23:40 shouldn't say the fruits of the goodly trees. It should say the tree that has goodly fruit. So the tree that has goodly fruits would be the olive tree. Why? Because this is an agricultural society. Olives were a very important resource because you got oil from them. And so actually to tell you, to this day, I shouldn't say to this day, I'm a young guy, but I should tell you that every year I go to my cousin's house, and in the back I take branches from his olive tree and I use them for my sukkah every year. I've also made him promise that if they ever sold the house, they would grant me an easement so I can go onto the property of the new owners, so I could take some of those olive trees as well for my sukkah. So Shemini Atzeret. This is the final section we're going to look at, is this holiday called Shemini Atzeret. It is, I think, been overshadowed by this concept of Simchat Torah. Now, Simchat Torah, as we talked about earlier, was rejoicing over the Torah and dancing with the Torah and being in this unbridled love, this unconditional love also for the Torah. So let's talk about those two concepts together. All right, so the Karaite calendars, remember I showed you earlier the calendar that had Yom Teruah from Egypt and Israel. Well, let's see what they did in Egypt for this holiday. You can see on the left there, they call it Shemini Atzeret, and then it says Ve Simchat Torah and Simchat Torah. And now you look at the calendar on the right, which is the modern Israeli calendar, and it just says Shemini Atzeret. It doesn't say Simchat Torah at all. It just says Shemini Atzeret. Again, they've moved back to the biblical basics. And again, they should be commended for this. Thank you. They're trying to put emphasis back onto the biblical holidays and not later additions. Now, don't get me wrong. I have no doubt that they're doing something to commemorate what most people call Simchat Torah. It's a custom that is deeply ingrained into virtually all Jewish communities. But I do want to point out that at least the calendar has gone back to the basics. So we're going to look back at this book, The Palanquin. We talked about this earlier. So what does the author of this book say? He says, and the day of Shemini Atzeret, which is on the 22nd day of this month, is a holiday in its own right, not included in the days of Sukkot. Rather, it is the completion of the appointed times of the sacred occasion. So he's saying that Shemini Atzeret is a separate holiday from Sukkot. By the way, that is the traditional Karaite view. And it is the completion of all the appointed times for the year. Remember back when we showed you that first slide of the holidays of Leviticus 23, the last one listed is Shemini Atzeret. Then it says, and this is when we complete the reading of the Torah according to the institution of the good figs who came up from Babylon to the land of Israel at the time of the building of the second temple. By the way, you see there's a footnote 82 there. If you want to understand why the good figs is a reference to the Karaites, by the book, you'll read the footnote and you could see that for about 1,000 years, Karaites have made maybe even longer, made an association between the good figs and the Karaites or the proto-Karaites. And also, I should point out that I think most scholars today and most Jews today would probably say that the reading of the Torah, this section of the Torah, and it was actually a much later cycle. Was probably not instituted by the good figs who came up from Babylon, but that was his view. We should study it and see if it's correct. Then he says, this holiday is called Shemini Atzeret. Notice he doesn't say it's called Simchat Torah. This holiday is called Shemini Atzeret. And it means the eighth day, the time of being restrained inside, right? That's how he would translate it. Because the people would remain restrained inside the temple rather than going home. and they would offer burnt offerings and give thanks to God for all the acts of mercy, to allowing them to get through all the holy days in a state of health and safety, and they rejoiced in completing all the holidays. So what he's saying is that the purpose of Shemini Atzeret is that we were restrained in the temple. You remember, for those of you who don't know, there were 3 pilgrimage festivals a year where the Jewish men had to go and appear before God at the temple. And this is one of them. And what he's saying is that there's an extra day where you were restrained there, called Shemini Atzeret. So for him, the joy of this holiday is the completing of the holidays, not Simchat Torah, or this concept of Simchat Torah, or at least that's how he explains it here. He doesn't mention Simchat Torah anywhere as far as I recall. I think that's very beautiful, right? So in a few weeks, when you finish the holidays, whether you're celebrating Simchat Torah or Shemini Atzeret, just take a moment and thank God for allowing you to get to this place in health and safety and happiness so that you can rejoice in completing the holidays. This picture here, we saw it at the beginning. This is the Feast of the Rejoicing of the Law at the synagogue in Livorno. This is Jews dancing with the Torah. I should tell you that one of my fondest memories, or some of my fondest memories from my childhood, involve Simchat Torah, right? So the Karaites here in the United States and in Egypt, and again, I'm sure in Israel, we celebrate something like Simchat Torah. We celebrate on Shemini Atzeret. We sing a song, Simchu Yedidim Besimchat Torah. The Jews rejoice on Simchat Torah. And what's interesting about this song is actually not of Karaite origin. This song is of Rabbinite origin. At least we can assume it's of Rabbinite origin because it also appears in rabbinic books. There's nothing wrong with rejoicing. There's nothing wrong with the song. But the general view amongst historians and amongst scholars is that if you see a poem, a non-biblical prayer of any sort, in a Rabbinite book and in a Karaite book, the general view is that it was something the Karaites borrowed from the Rabbinites. Some of my fondest memories are singing the song and dancing, and I think it's really beautiful to rejoice over the Torah. But the question is, have we done so at the expense of a true biblical holiday and whatever concepts underlie those holidays? One of the things I actually want to make sure we kind of circle back to here is that the Torah doesn't tell us what the purpose of Yom Teruah is. It just calls it Yom Teruah. In the rabbinic tradition, it's been ritualized in the terms of blowing a shofar. Then the Torah doesn't say what the connection between Yom Teruah is and Yom Kippur. But in both the Karaite and the Rabbinite tradition, there's this concept of 10 days of repentance, 10 days of mercy between Yom Teruah and Yom Kippur. And both communities are ritualizing in the form of reading selichot, penitential prayers and confessions during this 10 days. Why? To prepare yourself for Yom Kippur. Now, Yom Kippur is interesting, right? The Torah tells us exactly what it's for. You shall afflict your soul for the purpose of purifying yourself. So maybe there was no reason to ritualize it because the Torah tells us what to do. Karaite and Rabbinites agree. Afflict your soul means to fast. Now, I should also say maybe it wasn't overly ritualized because it was too holy of a day, right? Most people say, and I think it's right, that Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year. Okay, then you get to Sukkot, right? And it says talking about taking. And what does it mean to take? The Torah doesn't tell us what to do with these 4 things that it tells us to take. It's been ritualized in the rabbinic tradition as lifting the species, and most Rabbinite Jews, again, they wave them in the 6 cardinal directions. It's been ritualized in that matter, right? The Karaites are very mechanical about it. It says take. We have this verse in Nehemiah 8:15 that says use it to build the Sukkot, so we build the Sukkot out of it. By the way, I want to throw a shout out to the minority Karaite opinion. Have some trail mix this Sukkot. Make your own, buy some in the store, have some trail mix this Sukkot. You would make me very happy. And then you get to Shemini Atzeret or Simchat Torah. Again, the Torah doesn't say what is Shemini Atzeret, what are we supposed to do on it, why is it there, how does it relate to the other holidays. At least the Karaite from the book The Palanquin, at least he thought that it was a holiday where we were restrained inside the temple, meaning we couldn't go anywhere, and we were supposed to give thanks to God for helping us reach the end of the holidays in health and safety. And again today, in most communities, Simchat Torah has overshadowed Shemini Atzeret, almost the fact that most people don't know what Shemini Atzeret is. And this day is being ritualized into the rejoicing over the Torah. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's a bad tradition. I'm not saying any of these things are bad. Who am I to say, right? But I want you to understand what the concepts are so that when you approach the holidays, you can ask yourself some very interesting questions. What does the Torah say? What is my practice around them? Are those 2 things inconsistent? Or are they mostly consistent? Or are they reasonable interpretations of each other? Or are they just something that is not based in the Torah at all, and we like the custom, and it's not anti-Torah, so it's fine. So that's the learning for the holidays of the 7th month. I want to thank you all for following along. We should be back soon with learning 4 through 10. So anyway, thank you very much. Moadim l'simcha, everybody.